Component state. Hello everyone, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget I want to take a look at another interactive feature of React.js components known as the state. Ah yes, React.js, the perfect unidirectional, unchanging, immutable user interface generator inside of JavaScript. Except, well, wait a second, if it's immutable and unchanging, it's not going to respond to user interaction very well, is it? And user interfaces do respond to user interaction. We need to be able to do that. So enter component state. Component state at the technical level is a collection of mutatable properties that affect the final rendered output of the component. What? Well, if you think back to our component properties are intended to be immutable. They don't change. You set them once and your component simply renders the value of whatever is in those properties. Now those properties are set by, well, some parent thing, It might be the initial data that you get from your server, or it might be a parent component, but regardless, a component does not change its own properties. Nothing that happens inside of a component should change its own properties. But state can change. The component can change its own state. And you think about this in terms of, well, the example I got up here is a button. This button has two different states. It's either pressed or not pressed. Right? There it is, depressed. There it is, not depressed. So this button in the user interface, when I've got my mouse clicked and held down on it, it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to render differently than if it's unpressed. So I should have a state that represents whether or not this button is pressed. It's either pressed false or pressed true. And it's important to understand that this state is being modified by the component itself. The button is recognizing whether or not it's pressed, and it's responding to the action of being depressed, or of the mouse, the mouse button clicking down on it, and it's changing the way it renders because of that. So properties and state inside of React.js, they're often confused and they're often mixed up. I found a great article right here. I've got the URL right on screen. Go ahead and read it. It's not very long, and it does an excellent job explaining the comparisons between the two. But this little chart right from that article I really liked. It sort of broke it down nice and easily. So props versus state. Can they get their initial value from the parent component? Yes, both of them can be set initially by the parent. Can they be changed by the parent component? Well, props is yes, but state is no. So here's the first big difference between the two. State is sort of like a private property bag. It can only be changed by the component itself, not by its parent component. Can it get its default values inside the component? Yes. Can it change inside the component? Again, here we have a difference. Now state can be changed inside the component, but again, our properties are meant to be immutable. They can't. And then, can we set the initial value for child components? Yes, on both of these. And can we change the value of it in a child component? And the answer for properties is yes, because a parent component can update its children, basically causing them to re-render, but not for state. Again, state is private, so those children handle their own state. They manage their own state. They should not get updated. So one thing that I want you to remember when you're developing larger, more complex user interfaces with React.js is that state is completely optional. Your properties are probably not optional. I mean, technically they are, but chances are you're going to need some properties in your component. But state is optional. So as much as possible, you should build stateless components. Those are desirable when appropriate, and you really don't want to break down your user interface into as many stateless components as possible. Isolating and identifying the individual spaces within your UI where you need a stateful component, and that's where you're going to respond to user interaction or to outside events. Breaking it down at this point and understanding how to organize that, we'll talk about in a later nugget, but it's really important to creating a solid foundation for a React.js user interface. Now before we jump in and see how to do this, we're going to introduce two new concepts here alongside of state. We're going to introduce the getInitialState function and the setState function. So getInitialState is defined by us on our class, on our component, and what we do there is we set the initial values of a component state if we want to. So that's the function where we identify what the initial values for our state should be. Set state is a function that is already on our class. It's inherited from React for us, and we call it whenever we want to update the state. The reason we do that is because calling set state informs React that it needs to re-render this component. When we call set state, we are theoretically changing the state of the values, and it's going to re-render that component to the virtual DOM, perform its comparison between the virtual DOM and the actual DOM, and then update the actual DOM with whatever has actually changed. That's the whole React lifecycle, right? So calling set state in order to update the value of our state is really important to trigger this change throughout React.js. So here is my first fiddle using the state of my component, and you can see what I'm doing up here is, well, I've just got a button that says I've been clicked this.state.count times. Notice curly braces indicating this.state.count is JavaScript inside of my JSX, but it's just a button that's just going to tell me how many times it's been clicked. I've called it a click counter. Very creative, I think, there. And you can see I've got get initial state defined right here first. And all this does is return an object with a variable called count set to 0. That's where this.state.count comes from. So that get initial state function is really important to define and set the initial values for my state and establish what state variables or what properties I have inside of my state property bag. Then all I do down here is I simply render my click counter. Alright, lickety split. So I've got a component now, I've got a state, and I'm rendering that state, but you'll notice it doesn't update, it doesn't change. I've been clicked 0 times. That's because I set the initial state, but I'm not doing anything with it. So what I wanted to do with this is demonstrate to you how you populate that state object inside of your component with the get initial state function, but now we actually want that state to do something. We want it to change or mutate over time, in this case in response to user interaction. That user interaction being, well, the click that I'm about to perform. Alright, so here we go. I've got the exact same code that I had before, except I've added in one additional function here called increment. Now increment is my own self-defined function that I've added on my component. So I'm finally breaking out of the shell of React defined things, and I'm creating my own function that this component is going to have. Specifically, it's called increment. What is it going to do? It's going to call this.setState. Remember, I talked about that. This.setState is going to be the function wherein I update my state variables so that React knows that it needs to re-render, well, in this case, my button. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to set the count equal to this.state.count plus 1. Alright, great. Now I've got a function that will increase my count by 1. Of course, if you're paying close attention, it still doesn't happen. It still doesn't work. And why not? And that's because I'm not actually calling the increment function. I need to add in one last little bit of code here. I'm going to put right down on my button. I'm going to say on click this dot increment. See here, I'm simply going to put this function right inside of the on click for my button element. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this. It's going to look exactly the same, but every time I click it, look at that value. It's going up by 1 now. So every time I click, my this.increment function is being called. This.increment is setting the state, or rather calling the setState function on my component, and it's changing the state. Because I called setState, React knows to re-render the component, and it's updating that button with the new value, and I can sit here and click away, and this is going to do a nice job of re-rendering every time I click it. Now what I really, really like about this is the first time we're seeing some of this unidirectional data flow really being performant for us, and that is the render function is largely unchanged. Yes, I had to add the on click event to it, but otherwise I'm just rendering the button with the current state. I don't care when or how often that state is going to change. I'm assuming that my properties and my state are going to be up to date at render time. React is going to handle rendering that to the virtual DOM and performing the diff and doing all that other stuff. So I've got a really simple, easy, understandable render section of my component. Even though my component is now up to 19 lines of code, I can look right at this and I can understand how my component gets rendered. So that concludes this nugget on component state. Let me recap a little bit. Component state, like component props, are a collection of properties for our component that simply contain values that are going to use to affect how the component renders. Unlike props, state is meant to be changed over time, typically in response to user events. So we can use component state to manage things like clicks or updates that happen from the user that the component itself needs to manage. We use getInitialState in order to set the initial values for our state, and then we use something called setState in order to update those values and ensure that React.js re-renders the component appropriately. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.